2 years on the front lines had taught Silas Hale to detect danger in silence. But nothing had shocked him more than the scene inside his daughter's classroom. The desks were bare, the clock was ticking past 5, and in the back corner, Hazel and Hope, the twin girls he'd dreamed of in battle, sat shivering in faded pink dresses. Their teacher leaned close, whispering words that frightened them, a smile too sweet to be real. In the doorway, Ranger, the loyal German shepherd who had saved Silas's life, growled softly, sensing a threat no bullet could penetrate. What could have caused two innocent children to cower like prisoners in their own school? The answer waited in the darkness, and Silas was about to find out. The door sighed as it closed behind him, and for a breath the school held its own heartbeat fluorescent hum, a distant locker slam, the faint chalk dust scent that every childhood remembers. Silas Hale paused to let his eyes adjust from the harbor glare to the quarter's cooler light. 2 years away had thinned him and sharpened him. Sun cut a permanent squint at his temples, and a pale scar traced the ridge of his right knuckle where a steel hatch had snapped shut during a sandstorm night. He wore plain clothes because uniforms make children stiffen, but the way he carried his shoulders announced a soldier anyway. Weight back, gaze level, listening with more than ears. At his heel moved Ranger, a black and tan German shepherd with a muzzle beginning to frost and the steady confidence of a partner who has run toward fire and back again. Once on a convoy road where heat rose like breath from the earth, Ranger had dragged Silas clear of a rollover, paws bleeding, tail still thumping as if to insist on survival. Since then, the dog had learned a different theater. Grocery aisles, ferry docks, the Sunday hush of a small-town chapel where he lay at Silas's boot like an old hymn. Harbor's Edge Elementary smelled of construction paper and lemon cleaner, and the Atlantic creeping in through the window seams. Outside, gulls heckled the afternoon, and the tide flexed against the granite breakwater. The hallway to 4C stretched long and empty this late, lockers like small tin chapels, each with its own confessional magnet or crayon drawing. On the corkboard, a finger-painted map of Maine bloomed in blues and green swirls. Somewhere in the haze of childish rivers and candy-colored counties, two bunnies had been drawn with floppy ears. Silas touched the edge of that paper gently, as if the paint could still smudge onto his finger, then moved on. The classroom door stood ajar. In the slice of view, he saw Hazel and Hope, just as he had seen them in dreams on cold bunks overseas. Two small frames in faded pink dresses, mirror sisters who were not mirror same. Hazel, older by 5 minutes, wore her hair in a loose braid that had begun to leak strands like seagrass. Hope kept hers clipped back with a butterfly barrette whose enamel wing was chipped at the tip. Their shoes didn't match. One lace frayed, one bow crooked, and that tiny disorder struck him harder than a siren. Miss Caro stood half-turned away, a silhouette of careful posture and a floral dress that looked harmless as a tea towel. She was early 40s by the way her smile had learned to hold in place, hair a lacquered brown that reflected the slanted sun, lipstick the color of ripe berries. Her voice, when she aimed it toward passing parents, floated light as a gull. Now, bent close to Hazel's ear, it flattened into something quiet as a pin pushed through fabric. Hazel's shoulders ticked at the whisper, the way a fold twitches at a fly. Ranger's hackles rose in a soft wave. Silas knocked once with his knuckles and hinged the door wider. The light rearranged itself. "Dad?" Hope's voice tried to be bright and landed somewhere thinner. She stood so fast her chair legs scraped. Hazel stood slower, as if cataloging each muscle for permission. Silas smiled and set the habit-worn stuffed bunny, a twin of the one drawn on the map, onto the desk between them. "Thought you might need a co-pilot," he said. The girls reached together and in reaching relaxed as if a current had lowered. Miss Caro's smile presented itself like a business card. Up close, Silas saw a faint indent at the base of her ring finger, where a band might have been, and a small crescent scar at the jawline, a life with its own absences, he noted without sympathy or judgment. "Mr. Hale," she sang, warm and well-practiced. "What a surprise! Hazel and Hope were simply staying a bit late. Big feelings today. Reunions are complicated at this age." She touched Hazel's shoulder in a gesture that would photograph as care. Hazel flinched so slightly that anyone but a father or a dog would miss it. Ranger didn't miss it. His low sound wasn't a threat, not yet. It was the sound he made near invisible fences or men who smelled of flint and whiskey before noon. "We'll head home," Silas said, easy as weather. "Thank you for looking after them." He took each girl's small hand in one of his and felt the difference. Hope's grip was damp and fierce. Hazel's cool and disciplined, a child's attempt to imitate calm. On the way out, he stopped. "Do you have something of theirs?" he asked, casual, as if he might be speaking to the coat rack. Miss Carroll blinked. "They're a trinket," he said. "A piece of sea glass on a string. I sent them with one at Christmas." Miss Carrow's brows lifted in polite confusion. "No, I don't think so. Perhaps it's in their cubby." "Perhaps," Silas said. He didn't look toward the cubbies. He looked at Ranger, who sniffed with purpose along the baseboard, then fixed his gaze at the edge of the teacher's desk where wood met wool. The dog's tail lowered to a metronome's half beat. A muscle moved in Silas's cheek. "We'll check at home," he said, and they left the room that smelled faintly now of roses and something metallic like a coin pressed too long in a palm. The walk to the car was a small ceremony of normal. Hazel guarding the bunny, Hope counting tiles, Ranger placing himself a body width between the girls and the wall. Outside, the harbor had turned its afternoon silver, and boats shouldered softly against their ropes. Silas drove through downtown where the bakery chalkboard promised blueberry turnovers and the bait shop promised miracles, and into the neighborhood of spruce and salt boxes where Aunt Maren waited. She opened the apartment door with a look that tried to be both brave and ordinary. Maren Whitcomb had the kind of face that kept working even when she stopped brows knitting, mouth-forming silent lists. 36, once a children's librarian before hours were cut, she now worked at the harbor office 2 shifts a day, counting lobster tags and answering questions from tourists who wanted tied like a timetable. She had a pink scar on one forearm from pulling a pot roast too quickly from the oven the winter her sister died. Grief moves hands faster than they should. "He's taller," Maren said, and then laughed at herself because that was something grandmothers say. She hugged Silas with one arm and the girls with both, and reached down to ruffle Ranger's ears with a practiced scratch. "There he is." Harbor's favorite church mouse with a siren Ranger leaned into the touch until his back leg thumped the floor once, twice. The living room bore the careful disorder of love. Colored pencils in a low bowl, a blanket with clouded whales draped across the couch, a framed photo of 2 little girls on the beach holding up a chain of sea glass like a bright river. On a small hook beside the kitchen doorway hung one piece of that glass on a twine cord, a soft green oval worn by years in the tide. Its twin should have hung beside it. The hook was empty. "It fell?" Silas asked. Maren's smile thinned. "They said they must have misplaced it." She switched to brightness too quickly. "Soup is on the stove. There's bread if the gulls haven't learned to open the bag." They ate, and the talk was braided from short strands. How Ranger refused to accept a vacuum cleaner as a non-combatant. How Hope had learned to whistle, but only inward. How Hazel could name 6 constellations without looking up at the night. Silas listened the way he did at briefings, head cocked, eyes patient, making space where words might step if they felt safe. Later, when the girls bathed and emerged damp-haired and wrinkled as raisins, Ranger stationed himself in the hall, front paws exactly on the threshold of their room, a sphinx with a child's bedtime for a riddle. Silas stayed in the kitchen with Maren, the soft dull of spoons against bowls, the window dark as a harbor mouth. "How bad is it?" he asked. Maren folded a towel until it was the shape of an answer and then opened it again. "They wake sometimes," she said. "They say, 'Don't pull me,' or 'I'll be fast, I promise.' They don't want to be late to anything. Hazel will take the blame for things I saw Hope do, and Hope cries when Hazel takes the blame." "Sorry," she set the towel down very gently. A teacher's voice should not live in a child's dreams. Silas nodded. He told her nothing about the doorframe, the whisper, the flinch. He told her he had a plan because he always did, even when the plan was only to breathe and watch. He walked down the hall to kiss foreheads, Hazel's careful, Hope's fiercely grateful. On the nightstand between their beds lay the stuffed bunny, and beside it, a small dish with 3 pennies and a chipped enamel barrette. "We'll find the glass," he said. "It likes being found." "What if it doesn't?" Hope asked, already halfway into sleep. "Then we'll make something else into a talisman," Silas said. "That's the secret of this town. Everything becomes something if the tide loves it long enough." Ranger lifted his head, ears like radar, then let sleep take him back down. When Silas returned to the kitchen, he opened the battered notebook he'd once used for times and coordinates. He wrote a new heading in small neat letters, Harbor's Edge 4C. Beneath it, he drew a line for today and left it blank, because the first entry is a promise more than a report. He set the notebook down and, through the thin apartment wall, heard the wind shift and the buoy bell call from the mouth of the cove, counting a rhythm older than any man's vigilance. Somewhere in that rhythm, a child's fear would fit for now. He intended to break the pattern, gently if he could, loudly if he must. He rinsed the bowls. He smiled at Marin's quiet and the dog's steady breathing, and the way the house felt like a chest learning how to expand after holding itself tight too long. Tomorrow he would return to the school at an hour that didn't look like a patrol. Tomorrow he would ask the right questions in the wrong places. Tonight he would be a father in a kitchen where bread waited and a green oval of sea glass shone like a small lantern. And the space beside it, empty hook. Deliberate gap glowed even brighter for being bare. Morning light in Harbor's Edge carried the salt of the Atlantic and the smoke of bakery ovens, softening the stone sidewalks with warmth. Yet inside the brick walls of Harbor's Edge Elementary, the air shifted differently when Ms. Caro's heels struck the tiled floor. To parents, she was charm embodied. Early 40s, hair curled neatly at her shoulders, floral skirts chosen with care, and a laugh pitched to soothe. They admired her energy, her sharp red lipstick, her assurances that every child under her watch was blooming. Mothers confided in her at the gate, fathers tipped hats with the confidence of trust. Yet the moment the last wave of parental footsteps faded, the sweetness drained like sugar into rainwater. Her voice thinned to something brittle, eyes narrowing behind the painted smile. Hazel and Hope felt the shift most sharply, their bodies tightening the moment the door closed. Hazel, though only 9, had learned to fall into stillness like a bird bracing against a storm. Hope reacted faster, tugging sleeves down her arms, fingers searching for the absent sea glass necklace that once comforted her. Their pink dresses, hand-me-downs washed thin by Aunt Marin's careful hands, seemed to place targets on their shoulders. Miss Caro's cruelty wore precision. She pinched Hazel's side beneath the desk when she walked past, her manicured nail leaving a sting that wouldn't bruise but would teach silence. Hope, slower at arithmetic, often earned a twist of hair pulled so sharply her eyes watered. Caro leaned close to hiss, "Brainless twins, useless little mirrors." Her tone so low no other adult could hear, yet heavy enough that the words settled into bone. Around the classroom, other children learned to avert their eyes. Silence became the currency of survival. At the back corner sat Miss Elena Reyes, a graduate student in her mid-20s, completing her teaching practicum. She wore her dark hair in a loose bun that always unraveled by noon, leaving strands falling across her round glasses. Her notebook was never far from her hand. Raised in a family of migrant workers who moved between Florida orchards and Maine blueberry farms, Reyes had known exhaustion since childhood, had felt what it meant to keep quiet around authority. That history made her eyes sharper than most. She saw the subtle way Hazel's hands shook when Ms. Caro's footsteps drew close, the defensive hunch Hope carried even when only called to answer a question. Reyes began to jot small notes phrases like avoidance reflex, flinch at contact, persistent fatigue. Her pen pressed hard enough to score the page. She told herself it was just observation, yet a knot in her chest whispered otherwise. Nurse Margaret O'Connor, the school nurse, met the twins later that week. O'Connor was in her late 50s, a woman with silver hair cropped short, and the blunt kindness of someone who had raised 4 sons through broken bones and fevered nights. She carried her Irish ancestry in her freckles and in the lilt that clung faintly to her vowels. Years earlier, she had lost her husband to a fishing accident, the sea taking him one unremarkable morning. Since then, she had poured her tenderness into the children who wandered into her infirmary, treating even scraped knees like matters of dignity. When Hope arrived complaining of dizziness, O'Connor gently held her wrist and noticed the faint oval bruise where fingers had gripped too hard. She asked softly what had happened. Hope's eyes darted sideways, then downward. "I fell while running." The words were too rehearsed. O'Connor didn't press further. She simply noted avoidance reaction in her chart and underlined it twice. Caleb Morton, a boy of 10 with sandy hair that refused to stay flat, had been repeating fourth grade after struggling with reading comprehension. He carried the stigma quietly, shoulders stooped as if apology were his natural posture. Yet he also carried an old MP3 recorder, a birthday gift from a cousin who no longer used it. Caleb liked to record bird songs behind his house, or sometimes his own voice reading aloud, practicing until the syllables stopped tangling. In class, sitting 2 rows behind the twins, he began one day to record Miss Caro's voice. At first it was accidental. He had switched it on for the satisfaction of red light blinking, but when he caught the cruel edge in her whisper and Hazel's muffled gasp, something inside him steadied. The boy who struggled with words discovered that sound itself could become evidence. Ranger, too, played his part. Silas often let the dog wait by the schoolyard fence in the afternoons. Children loved to stroke his ears, and Ranger, with soldierly patience, tolerated sticky hands and high voices. One afternoon, as Caleb lingered with his recorder in his pocket, Ranger pressed his head against the boy's side, a gentle nudge that startled him into laughter. For the first time, Caleb looked up and saw Hazel and Hope standing nearby. Ranger trotted between them, tail sweeping low, and then sat squarely at their feet, his body forming a bridge. Caleb, shy and stammering, whispered to Hazel, I heard her. I have it." The girls didn't answer, but their eyes widened, recognition sparking like 2 lanterns in a dark field. Ranger yawned, unbothered, yet his watchful gaze lingered on the classroom windows, as if he too knew what secrets clung behind the glass. At home, Aunt Maren began to notice changes she couldn't name. Nights grew heavier with muffled cries. Hazel, normally the one to comfort her sister, now murmured in her sleep, "Don't pull me." Hope whimpered, "I'll be faster, I promise." Maren would sit on the edge of their bed, stroking damp hair, heart grinding with guilt that she couldn't decipher the code of their fear. Her own exhaustion from balancing 2 jobs left shadows under her eyes, but her love made her fight sleep to listen longer, hoping to catch words that might give her answers. The sea glass necklace, still missing, haunted her too, as though its absence was tied to whatever darkness was pressing on the children. The twins began clutching each other's hands on the walk to school, holding tighter than before. Their bond, frayed by fear, became their shield. Silas watched quietly from the kitchen doorway in the mornings, noticing but not yet asking. Ranger noticed too, slipping between them like a sentinel, his shoulder brushing theirs, his body saying what words could not. "No harm will pass without me knowing." And yet, behind the classroom door, the whispers persisted, wrapped in a smile parents trusted, sharpened into knives only children felt. The evening after another long day at Harbor's Edge Elementary, Silas sat at the small kitchen table in Aunt Maren's apartment, the surface lit only by a desk lamp whose glow seemed older than the room itself. He placed before him the battered leather-bound notebook he had carried through deserts and jungles, pages filled with coordinates, patrol times, and the quiet details that had once kept men alive. Tonight, its blank pages waited for something else. The war inside his daughter's classroom. He wrote the date, then listed the marks he had observed. Hope's wrist bruise, Hazel's flinching silence, the fatigue that clung to them like wet clothes. Slowly he added notes from Aunt Maren's whispered confessions, night terrors, pleading words in dreams, the missing sea glass charm. He drew lines, arrows, the beginnings of a battlefield map. The enemy wore perfume instead of camouflage, but his instincts told him the terrain was just as treacherous. Ranger lay by his feet, head on his paws, eyes open, listening as though he too were memorizing every detail. The next morning, Silas sought Nurse Margaret O'Connor. She greeted him in her cramped infirmary, walls lined with faded posters of food pyramids and hand-washing charts. Margaret's hands were calloused from decades of practical work, her voice gentle but never indulgent. She listened as Silas carefully framed his concerns, his tone measured, A soldier's report disguised as a parent's worry. Margaret reached into a drawer and produced the health chart. She showed him her notes: March scratch on Hazel's arm, April bruise on Hope's shoulder, repeated complaints of headaches, fatigue, weight loss, always explained away as accidents, always near the same days. Her eyes tightened. I can't accuse without proof, she said, but I've lived long enough to know when a child's fear isn't imagination. Silas copied the dates into his notebook, the pen pressing hard. Later that day, he found Miss Elena Reyes in the library corner, sorting math worksheets with her usual distracted focus. She looked younger in the soft light, her glasses slipping down her nose, yet there was a firmness in her spine that came from years of carrying responsibilities beyond her age. She had grown up the eldest of four, interpreting for her Spanish-speaking parents during landlord disputes and doctor visits. That childhood responsibility made her voice steady now, even as her fingers fidgeted with the edges of papers. I've noticed things, she admitted when Silas asked, things I can't unsee. From her bag, she produced a small USB drive. One of the students, Caleb, recorded something. I shouldn't even have this, but when I heard it, I knew someone had to know. Silas accepted the device with a nod that carried both gratitude and gravity. Ranger, sitting at the doorway, wagged once as if to confirm the moment's weight. That same week, during dismissal, Ranger pulled free from Silas's grip and trotted back into the school hallway. Silas followed quickly, only to find the dog sitting alert outside the principal's office door, ears forward, posture stiff. Principal Merritt's secretary chuckled nervously at the sight. Well, he looks ready to guard the place, she said. Silas smiled faintly but noted how Ranger's nose pointed toward the floor near a small vent. Something had been there, some trace invisible to human eyes. The secretary bent to scratch the dog's head, charmed by his discipline. But Silas read the gesture differently. Ranger had found a scent worth filing away. Later, when the school had emptied, Silas and Ranger lingered near classroom 4C. The janitor unlocked doors for mopping, and in the shuffle of chairs and dust, Ranger nosed beneath a cabinet and carefully lifted something onto the floor. A piece of sea glass strung on twine, pale green, worn smooth, unmistakable. Hazel's missing talisman. Silas knelt, fingers brushing the glass, feeling how cold it was even in the warm air. He remembered Hazel's dream voice, "Don't pull me," and the absence on the hook at home. He placed the necklace into a small envelope and sealed it into his notebook as though it were evidence tagged for trial. Ranger sat beside him, chest rising in quiet pride, tail wagging once before settling again. That evening, Silas dialed a number given to him years earlier by another veteran father. It belonged to Blythe Monroe, a lawyer in her early 40s who worked with a regional child protection nonprofit. Blythe's voice was clear, deliberate, and without hesitation. She had once been a prosecutor in Boston, but after witnessing too many cases dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence, she had turned her career toward advocacy. Her father had been a fisherman who vanished in a storm when she was a girl. That loss had shaped her into someone who could not abide silence when children were suffering. On the phone, Silas described what he had observed, careful not to accuse, but to present facts. Blythe asked sharp questions. Were there patterns, dates, corroboration? Silas read from his notebook, listing each mark, each incident, and now the sea glass necklace. There was a pause on the line, then Blythe said, "You're building a case. Don't stop. Get witnesses. Protect your daughters. When the time is right, we move together." Silas closed his notebook slowly, the words ringing like orders on a mission. At home, Hazel and Hope sat on the rug with Ranger, braiding his fur into pretend ribbons, their laughter small but real for the first time in days. Aunt Maren watched from the doorway, exhaustion hanging in her frame, but relief softening her face. Silas stood back, memorizing the sight. He knew tomorrow the whispers would return, but tonight he had his notebook, a timeline, a lawyer's voice in his ear, and a dog who refused to ignore the unseen. The corridors of Harbor's Edge Elementary were almost empty when Silas returned one late afternoon, his steps echoing softly against the tiled floor. He had timed it carefully, knowing the staff meeting schedules, knowing Miss Caro lingered longer than most teachers. He carried himself casually, a jacket draped over one arm, his hand jingling a set of keys. Ranger padded beside him, calm but alert, his ears swiveling with each sound. At the bend near meeting room 2, Silas allowed the keys to slip from his palm, clattering lightly across the linoleum. He bent down slowly, pressing the side of his phone with his thumb, an old soldier's reflex activating the recording shortcut he had programmed years ago. Through the thin wood of the door, voices bled out. Miss Caro's tone was no longer the syrupy cadence reserved for parents. It was sharp, thin as wire. "If those children start talking," she hissed, "I'll shut each one down. They're too weak to resist. No one believes them, and their parents are too busy to care." The words struck like stones dropped into water, sending ripples that would not vanish. Silas kept his face neutral, crouched as if merely retrieving his keys, but his heart marked every word like coordinates on a map. Ranger's hackles rose slightly, the dog leaning toward the door as though he could see through it. Silas ended the recording, stored it, and quietly sent a backup to his encrypted email. For the first time in weeks, his mouth curved into the faintest smile, not of joy, but of certainty. That evening at Aunt Moran's apartment, Silas laid the items on the table. The USB from Caleb, the notes from Nurse O'Connor, Ms. Reyes's observations, his own timeline, the sea glass necklace, and now the fresh recording. Marin stood by the counter, her hands gripping a dish towel as if it could steady her. She had always lived in Harbor's Edge, working double shifts to provide a roof over the twins, her face etched with both fatigue and resolve. She listened as Silas played the muffled recording. When Caro's voice spilled into the kitchen, Marin's lips tightened. "So it wasn't just bad dreams," she whispered. Her eyes filled, then hardened. "Then we have to act." "I should have acted sooner," Silas touched her shoulder. "Steady. We're doing the right thing. That's what matters now." The words echoed the same phrase he had once said to his unit in a desert night, now reshaped for family instead of soldiers. Meanwhile, in the schoolyard, Ranger continued his silent work. At dismissal, he stationed himself near the gate where Hazel and Hope emerged. His steady presence drew the gaze of other children who lingered. One boy, freckled with straw-colored hair and carrying a lunch pail too big for him, approached hesitantly. His name was Lucas, 7 years old, thin from long afternoons at his father's bait shop. He reached down to pat Ranger's head, and when the dog didn't move away, Lucas whispered, "She yelled at me, too. Said I was slow like my dad." I didn't tell anyone. Hazel and Hope exchanged looks, their eyes widening at the courage of his small confession. Ranger gave a soft woof, as if to seal a pact between children and dog. Lucas's words, though simple, became another thread in the widening web. News spread not by shouts, but by whispers. On the Harbor's Edge Parents Forum, an anonymous post appeared. "Do you know who teaches your children when the doors close?" The message was brief, unsigned, but it ignited a flicker of doubt. Within days, other parents began to share their experiences. A mother admitted her daughter had wet the bed every night during Caro's class year. A father recalled his son's sudden refusal to read aloud. Some posted photos of unexplained bruises, others fragments of diary entries written in a child's shaky hand. One message simply read, "My son never smiled that year." Each post added weight to the invisible scales. Blythe Monroe, the child protection lawyer, received Silas's call that week. She was deliberate as always, her voice clipped but unwavering. "This is no longer suspicion," she said. "This is a pattern. With recordings, medical notes, and parent testimonies, we can force an independent review. The school board may try to shield her, but we will go higher if needed." Silas heard Ranger shift at his feet, as though understanding the tone, the shift from waiting to action. At home, Aunt Marin sat with Hazel and Hope on the couch, holding their hands as they spoke in halting voices about class. "She says we're broken," Hope murmured. Hazel added, "She said no one cares what happens to us." Marin's throat tightened, but she didn't let the tears fall. Instead, she looked at Silas with a strength she hadn't shown in years. "We won't let her decide who they are." Silas nodded. Ranger pressed his head into the twins' laps, their small fingers tangling into his fur, finding comfort in warmth that no words could take away. The soldier's notebook was fuller now, pages dense with names, dates, fragments of evidence. Each page was another brick laid in a foundation that would not crumble under denial. Silas flipped back to the first entry and underlined a phrase he had written quietly weeks earlier. Harbor's Edge 4C. Beneath it, he added, "The truth speaks when we listen." Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight he allowed the stillness of the room, the breathing of his daughters, the dog at guard, and the resolve of his sister-in-law to remind him that war was not only fought abroad. Some battles waited behind classroom doors, whispered in poisoned sweetness, and it was his duty to break them open. The conference room of the Harbor's Edge district office was plain, lined with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, yet the tension inside it made the air feel charged. At one end of the long table sat Principal Merritt, his face drawn as if years of administrative caution had finally pressed him into stone. Opposite him, Miss Caro walked in with her shoulders straight, lips painted with the same shade of red that had masked her venom in the classroom. Her lawyer, a man in his 50s named Robert Haskins, followed, tall, lean, and silver-haired, a career defender of difficult cases, known for his sharp cross-examinations and cold courtesy. He carried himself with the indifference of someone used to discrediting small voices. On the other side of the table sat Silas Hale, his daughter's protector, no longer in uniform but carrying the posture of a soldier nonetheless. Beside him was Aunt Marin, her tired hands gripping a notebook tightly, a symbol that she would not let her guilt silence her again. Nurse O'Connor occupied a seat as well, her lined face steady, her health charts stacked before her. Miss Reyes, glasses slipping as usual, placed her annotated pages in neat order. At the edge of the table sat Caleb Morton with his mother, his small frame dwarfed by the formality of the setting, but his eyes determined. Ranger was not allowed inside, but Silas had left him with an officer at the lobby, the dog's presence radiating even from afar. The proceedings began. Principal Merritt opened with a measured tone, acknowledging complaints, the anonymous forum posts, and the compiled file. Blythe Monroe, sharp in a Navy suit and carrying an air of deliberate calm, presented the evidence. Audio recordings, health records, timelines. She had traveled from Boston to represent the children's side, her reputation lending gravity to every word. Haskins countered with phrases like, "Children misinterpret," "accidental bruises," "strict teaching mistaken for cruelty." Yet when the first recording was played, Caro's voice dripped venom across the sterile room. "If those children start talking, I'll shut each one down." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press on lungs. Margaret O'Connor leaned forward, pointing at the records. Every bruise had the same explanation. "I fell, but the pattern is too precise. Children invent stories, yes, but injuries do not lie." Reyes spoke next, her voice trembling at first, then firm. "I watched Hazel flinch before she was even touched. I watched Hope stare at her desk until her knuckles went white. No child should live in that posture of fear." Caleb's turn came last. He clutched his recorder, his mother's hand steady on his shoulder. I thought no one would believe me," he said, pressing play. Caro's insults filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The boy's chin lifted a fraction, courage settling where shame had once lived. Caro's painted smile cracked at last. Haskins objected, citing legality of recordings, but Blythe cut him with precision. When a child cannot rely on adults to protect them, their voices will find any tool they can. That is not a crime. That is survival. Principal Merritt cleared his throat, his eyes avoiding Caro's. "This board finds sufficient evidence. Miss Caro, your contract is terminated effective immediately. The file will be forwarded to the county for review of further disciplinary action." The gavel's strike was soft, yet final. Caro rose stiffly, her lawyer murmuring in her ear. Her eyes, once weapons, now flickered with something resembling fear as she left the room. Days later, the atmosphere in classroom 4C shifted like a tide after storm. Miss Reyes stood at the front, sunlight pouring across her desk. She began with small steps, gentle encouragement, open laughter, math problems framed as puzzles instead of punishments. Hazel and Hope hesitated at first, but soon Hazel raised her hand during a reading exercise, her voice shaky but audible. Hope followed, whispering an answer that earned a smile instead of scorn. Around them, classmates watched and seemed to exhale, as though permission to breathe had been restored. Even the walls felt lighter, no longer absorbing poison. After school, Ranger bounded alongside the twins at the harbor. They ran across the weathered pier, pink dresses fluttering, the dog's paws drumming rhythm against planks. He circled them, barked once in delight, then chased gulls until the girls shrieked with laughter. A fisherman, sunburned and smelling of salt, watched and nodded at Silas. "That dog's more guardian than most men I've seen." Silas only smiled, pride tugging at the corners of his scarred mouth. That evening, the family gathered for supper. Silas prepared chowder, the steam fragrant with clams and potatoes, while Marin set the table. Hazel and Hope argued cheerfully over who would sprinkle parsley. When they sat, Marin stood and hung the recovered sea glass charm on the corkboard above the counter. "It belongs here," she said softly. No longer a lost talisman, it now gleamed as a sign of permanence, of being safe, of being home. After dinner, Hazel curled against her father's side, Hope resting her head on Marin's lap. Silas closed his notebook, the pages full but the mission complete. He looked around the room at the warm light, at Ranger sprawled across the floor like a satisfied sentinel. His heart knew what the battle had taught him. Love, vigilance, and loyalty could be stronger than whispers meant to break children. The soldier had returned from foreign fields to discover that some wars are fought in classrooms, but with family and faith, even the smallest voices could lead them into the light. When the truth was finally spoken, it did more than end one teacher's cruelty. It gave two frightened girls back their voices and reminded us all that silence is never protection. Love, vigilance, and loyalty, even from a faithful dog, can shield children from the darkest whispers. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen courage rise in the most unexpected places, like Hazel and Hope, found in Ranger and their father Silas? Your voice matters here. Leave a comment. Like this video if it moved you. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel so more people can hear stories of hope, justice, and the quiet heroes who help bring children back into the light.